Daniel's key was still turning in the lock when he saw her standing in the hallway, and his hand froze on the handle. Vanessa never came home before 6. It was 4:15. She had on a black dress, the kind with a hem that stopped well above the knee, the kind he had not seen her wear in years. Her hair was down and freshly curled, and the curling iron was still plugged in down the hall, filling the air with the faint smell of heated product. She already had her heels on, even though she was still inside the house, as if she did not want to waste even 1 minute looking for them later. "You're home early," she said, as though that was the strange part of this moment, and not the rest of it. He set his bag down slowly by the door. "Where are you going?" "Out." She reached past him for her coat on the hook, and for a second, a perfume he did not recognize reached him, something sharper and sweeter than anything on her shelf in the bathroom. "Out where?" She turned to face him fully then, and there was no hesitation in her eyes, no small flicker of nerves he could have used as a thread to pull on. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see a new shade of lipstick on her mouth, close enough to catch that unfamiliar perfume again, and she reached up and straightened his collar, an old habit of hers from years ago, back when he used to come home from work, looking like he had lost a fight with his own tie. "I've got somewhere to be," she said. Then she picked up her keys from the bowl by the door and walked out, her heels clicking down the porch steps, and a moment later he heard her car start in the driveway and pull away. Daniel stood in the hallway for a long moment, his bag still hanging from his shoulder, the curling iron still warm down the hall, and he realized his heart was beating harder than it should have been for a woman simply leaving the house. He told himself there were 100 reasonable explanations: a surprise birthday dinner for a friend, a work event that had been moved last minute, a new dress because she felt like buying one, because women bought dresses sometimes and it meant nothing more than that. But his mind kept circling back to small things he had let pass over the last few months, things he had noticed and then chosen not to notice, the way a person steps around a crack in the sidewalk without ever looking down to see how deep it goes. 3 months ago, her phone had grown a passcode for the first time in the 6 years they had been married. She'd laughed it off when he mentioned it, said something about a work policy on client confidentiality, and he had let it go because pressing on a locked phone felt like the kind of thing that turned a small worry into a real fight. 6 weeks ago, there had been a charge on their joint account from a hotel bar downtown, somewhere neither of them had ever been together. When he'd asked about it over breakfast, not even accusing her, just curious, she had said it was drinks with a client, barely looking up from her coffee, and he had nodded and moved on to the next page of the newspaper because that was easier than sitting with the discomfort of not quite believing her. 2 weeks ago, he had come home early on a Saturday and found her car gone, even though she had told him that morning she was getting the oil changed. When she came back 2 hours later, there was no new sticker on the windshield, no receipt in the cup holder, nothing. He had noticed. He had said nothing. And there had been dinner last week, the two of them sitting across the small kitchen table the way they had 1,000 times before, except for how quiet it had gone, how she answered his questions with single words, and let long silences sit between them where conversation used to fill the space without effort. He had asked her, gently, whether anything was wrong, and she had looked up at him for a long moment with an expression he could not name, something between guilt and longing, before saying that she was just tired, and reaching for the dish towel to start clearing plates that were not yet empty, simply to give her hands something to do besides sit still under his gaze. And now this, a dress, heels, already on before she'd even left the house, a line delivered so calmly it felt rehearsed. "I've got somewhere to be." He walked into the kitchen and stood at the window that faced the street, half expecting to see her car still idling at the curb, as if some part of him believed this might still turn out to be nothing, a misunderstanding he could laugh about later. The street was empty. The afternoon sun lay flat and ordinary across the pavement, and somewhere down the block a sprinkler clicked on, and none of it matched the way his chest felt right then, tight and small, like something inside him had folded in on itself. He thought about calling her. His thumb was actually on his phone, her name pulled up on the screen, when he stopped himself. If he called, she would have an answer ready. She always did. She was quick that way, quick enough that by the time he worked up the nerve to ask a real question, she had already smoothed the moment over with something reasonable, something that made him feel foolish for wondering in the first place. He had watched her do it for weeks now without fully admitting to himself that was what she was doing. He did not want an answer this time. He wanted to see. The decision arrived in him almost before he realized he had made it. He grabbed his keys off the counter, the same bowl she had just taken hers from, and he was out the door and down the steps before the rational part of his brain could catch up and tell him this was not something reasonable people did. Her car was 3 streets ahead by the time he pulled out, but he caught the flash of her taillights turning right at the stop sign, and he followed, keeping 2 car lengths back the way he had seen people do in movies, feeling both ridiculous and completely unable to stop. He told himself this was not about catching her in anything. He told himself he simply wanted to know. The way wanting to know was different from wanting to accuse, even though right now, with his hands tight on the wheel and his pulse loud in his own ears, he could not have explained the difference to anyone who asked. The light ahead turned yellow. Her car slipped through it. His did not. He sat at the red light, watching her taillights shrink and merge into the traffic ahead, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles went pale, and for one terrible second he thought he had lost her completely, lost the only thread he had toward whatever was happening in his own marriage. Then the light changed, and he pulled forward, and there, 2 blocks up, he caught the edge of her car turning into the lot beside the old brick building that housed the downtown coffee shops and law offices, the same block, he realized with a small cold drop in his stomach, as the hotel bar from the credit card statement. He parked across the street, in front of a shuttered shoe repair shop, and turned off his engine, and sat there in the sudden quiet with his heart going so hard he could feel it in his throat. He had no plan. He had no idea what he expected to see, or what he would do with it once he saw it. All he knew, sitting in that car with the dress and the heels and the unfamiliar perfume still fresh in his mind, was that he could not go back to not knowing. So he watched the door of the building, and he waited, and somewhere behind that wave of dread sat a smaller, quieter fear he had not let himself name yet. The fear that whatever she was walking toward right now had nothing to do with another man at all, and everything to do with something from his own past that he had spent years convincing himself was safely buried. He did not know that yet. He only knew that his wife had looked him dead in the eye and told him she had somewhere to be, and that for the first time in 6 years of marriage, he had absolutely no idea where that was. The building itself gave nothing away. 3 stories of old brick, a law office on the 2nd floor with gold lettering on frosted glass, a dentist's office on the 3rd, and on the ground floor, a narrow cafe with dark windows that made it impossible to see more than a few feet inside from across the street. It was the kind of building a person walked past 1,000 times without ever wondering what happened behind its door. He thought about Ray, his younger brother, who would have told him to turn the car around and go home and ask his wife a direct question like an adult instead of sitting outside a building like a man in a bad film. Ray had always been the steady one, the one who solved problems by naming them out loud instead of circling them for weeks. Daniel almost laughed at the thought of calling him right now, of trying to explain why he was parked in front of a shuttered shoe repair shop with his hands shaking on the wheel. He did not call Ray. He did not call anyone. Whatever this was, he needed to see it for himself first, before anyone else's voice got into his head and told him what to feel about it. He thought, too, about the early years, before any of this, when Vanessa used to text him in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday just to say she missed him, when a locked phone would have seemed as strange to either of them as a locked diary, something only people with things to hide would ever need. He could not point to the exact day that had changed. It had not been one day. It had been a slow drift, the kind that only becomes visible once you finally stand far enough back from it. The way today, sitting outside this building, he was finally standing back. A car door slammed somewhere behind him, and he flinched so hard his head hit the rest, and when he looked back at the building, the door was just easing shut, and Vanessa was gone inside. He sat there a moment longer, telling himself to breathe, telling himself this was still nothing, even as his hand was already on the door handle, already pulling it open, already stepping out onto a sidewalk he had never once imagined himself standing on, about to follow his own wife into a building like a stranger. The lobby was small and dim, with a directory board listing the law office and the dentist, and, at the very bottom, a name he had not noticed from across the street, Doyle Investigations, Suite 1B. His stomach dropped at the word investigations, though he could not yet say why. He told himself it could mean anything: insurance claims, background checks for some company hiring decision. It did not have to mean what his mind was already racing toward. Through the glass door of the cafe beside the lobby, he caught a flash of black fabric at a corner table, and his whole body went still. Vanessa sat with her back half turned to the window, her curled hair catching the low light from the pendant lamp above the table, and across from her sat a man Daniel had never seen before in his life. The man looked to be in his 40s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a plain gray jacket over a collared shirt. Nothing flashy about him at all, which somehow made it worse. This was not some flirtation from a bar. This man had the look of someone who showed up places on purpose, with a job to do. Daniel ducked sideways before either of them could glance toward the door, pressing himself against the cool brick wall of the lobby, his heart slamming so hard he was sure it could be heard through the glass. He counted to 10, then he risked another look. They were talking, heads close together, and Vanessa's hands were wrapped around a coffee cup she was not drinking from. At one point, the man reached into a leather folder on the table and slid something across to her, something flat and pale, and Daniel watched his wife go very still as she looked down at it. He needed to get closer. He needed to hear even a single sentence, something that would tell him whether this was an affair unfolding in front of him or something else entirely, something he could not yet imagine. There was a narrow gap between the cafe's window display and a rack of free newspapers just outside the door, and Daniel slid into it, crouching slightly, feeling like an absolute fool and unable to stop himself anyway. Through the gap in the window lettering, he could just make out their voices, muffled by the glass but not lost entirely. "You're sure about the dates," Vanessa was saying, her voice low, careful, the voice she used when she was trying very hard not to let an emotion get the better of her in public. "As sure as the bank records let me be," the man answered. "I can keep pulling the thread if you want me to, but you should know now, before I go further, that some of what's underneath it might not be easy to hear." "I didn't hire you for easy," Vanessa said. Daniel's mouth had gone dry. He pressed closer to the glass, straining to hear more, and for one terrible second he was certain they were talking about him, that the dates and the bank records belonged to his own accounts, his own history, though he could not begin to guess what part of it could possibly interest a stranger in a gray jacket. Then the man's phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at it and said something Daniel could not catch, and Vanessa nodded and folded the pale piece of paper in half and slid it into her handbag, out of sight. A waiter rounded the corner of the lobby just then, carrying a tray of glasses toward the dentist's office upstairs, and Daniel had to step back fast, knocking the newspaper rack with his elbow hard enough that 2 free weeklies slid off and fluttered to the floor. He swore under his breath and bent to grab them, and when he straightened up, his pulse roaring in his ears, he saw the man in the gray jacket had turned his head toward the window. For one frozen second, their eyes nearly met through the glass. Daniel spun and walked, fast, out through the lobby door and onto the sidewalk, forcing himself not to run even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to. He crossed the street without looking properly, earning a sharp horn blast from a delivery van, and did not slow down until he was back inside his own car, with the doors locked, his hands shaking too hard to fit the key into the ignition on the first try. He sat there, breathing hard, watching the cafe door in his rearview mirror, half expecting Vanessa to come storming out, half expecting the man in the gray jacket to come find him and ask exactly what he thought he was doing crouched outside a window like that. Neither happened. The street stayed ordinary. A woman walked a small dog past his window. A bus hissed to a stop on the corner and pulled away again. He waited there for almost 40 minutes, watching that door, his mind replaying the fragments he had caught over and over, trying to force them into a shape that made sense. "You're sure about the dates?" "As sure as the bank records let me be. Some of what's underneath it might not be easy to hear." It did not sound like the conversation of 2 people falling into something romantic. It sounded clinical, procedural, the kind of conversation that happened in offices, not hotel rooms. And yet there was the dress. There was the perfume he did not recognize. There was the way she had looked at him in the hallway, calm and closed, like a door she had already decided to lock. When Vanessa finally came out of the building, alone, she did not look like a woman who had just had a pleasant afternoon. Her shoulders were drawn up tight near her ears, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hand pressed flat against her own chest, the way a person does when they are trying to hold something together from the outside. Then she walked to her car, got in, and drove off in the opposite direction from home. Daniel did not follow her this time. He sat there until her car disappeared around the corner, and then he sat there a while longer, staring at the brick building. At the gold letters on the directory board he could no longer read from this distance but had already memorized. Doyle Investigations. He drove home slowly, taking the long way, past the elementary school and the Little League fields, streets he and Vanessa had walked 100 times together when they first moved into the neighborhood, back when they used to talk about which house they would buy someday, which one had a yard big enough for the dog they never got around to getting. None of those streets looked the way he remembered them right now. Everything had a strange, tilted quality to it, like a photograph taken half a second after the moment it was supposed to capture. By the time he pulled into his own driveway, the sun had dropped low enough to throw long shadows across the lawn, and the house sat dark and quiet, exactly as he had left it that afternoon, the curling iron presumably still cooling on its little stand in the bathroom. He let himself in and stood in the same hallway where she had touched his collar and told him she had somewhere to be, and he tried to imagine what it would feel like to ask her directly, tonight, the second she walked through the door. Where were you? Who was that man? What did he give you? He knew, even as he imagined it, that he would not do it that way. Vanessa had a gift for redirecting a direct question before it landed, a way of turning his suspicion back into his own insecurity with just a few calm words, until he was the one apologizing for asking. It had happened enough times over the last few months that he no longer trusted himself to hold the line in a real conversation with her. He needed proof first, something undeniable, something she could not talk her way around. He thought of the folded paper she had slid into her handbag, out of sight before he could even guess at what was written on it. He thought of the name on the directory board, Doyle Investigations. Private investigators did not come cheap, and yet there had been no large unexplained withdrawal on their joint account. Nothing that would explain paying a man like that for his time, which meant either she was paying him in cash, skimmed slowly enough not to draw his attention, or there was a second account somewhere he did not know about, or someone else entirely was footing the bill. The thought lodged itself in his chest like a stone. He had assumed from the very first moment in the hallway that whatever Vanessa was hiding involved another man in a romantic sense. He had built the entire afternoon around that assumption, had let it carry him out of his own front door and across town and into a crouch behind a newspaper rack. But nothing he had overheard matched that story. Bank records, dates, underneath it. It sounded less like a love affair and more like an investigation into something, or someone, that had happened a long time before today. He went to find his laptop, telling himself he only wanted to look up the investigator's name, just to understand what kind of work the man did, nothing more than that. The website that loaded was plain and professional, a small firm specializing in what it called discreet personal inquiries, with a short list of services that included background checks, asset tracing, and what the site simply termed relationship verification, a phrase vague enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough to make Daniel's stomach turn over. There was no staff photo, no list of past clients, nothing that told him anything concrete about the man in the gray jacket beyond the careful, generic language of a business built on confidentiality. He scrolled through 3 short paragraphs about the firm's experience and discretion without learning a single useful fact, and yet the very plainness of it unsettled him more than something dramatic would have. This was not a man who chased people through alleyways. This was a man who sat across from people in quiet cafes and methodically confirmed the things they were already afraid of, one bank record at a time. Daniel closed the browser tab and opened a new one, and before he had fully decided to do it, his fingers were typing a different search into the bar, 3 words he had not let himself type in years. As the search results loaded, his mind kept circling back, unwillingly, toward a different question entirely, one he had not let himself think clearly about in years. What if this had nothing to do with Vanessa hiding something from him? What if it had everything to do with something he had hidden from her, a long time ago, so thoroughly and for so long that he had nearly convinced himself it no longer existed at all? He sat very still in front of the glowing screen, the search results for Doyle Investigations blurring slightly in front of him, and somewhere beneath the fear of catching his wife in an affair, a colder, older fear began to surface, one with a name he had not said out loud in 8 years. Marlene. He shut the laptop too fast, the sound loud in the empty house, and sat there in the dark kitchen with his hands pressed flat against the counter, trying to convince himself that the name rising up in his chest had nothing to do with any of this, even as some honest part of him already understood that it had everything to do with it, and that whatever Vanessa had walked into that building to find out this afternoon, she was getting closer to it with every hour that passed. He needed to know what she already knew, and the only way to find that out, he realized with a fresh wave of dread, was to go looking through his own house, his own wife's things, for evidence of a secret he himself had buried. The thought turned his stomach. It also would not let him go. By the time Vanessa's headlights finally swept across the kitchen window 3 hours later, Daniel was sitting at the table with 2 untouched cups of coffee gone cold in front of him, and a decision already made that he did not know yet how to carry out, without breaking something between them that might never be put back together. He heard her key turn in the lock, and quickly pushed both cold cups of coffee toward the sink, standing up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. By the time she stepped into the kitchen, he was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, trying to look like a man who had simply been waiting for his wife to come home, instead of a man who had spent the last several hours hiding behind a newspaper rack and searching the internet for the name of a private investigator. Vanessa had changed out of the black dress somewhere between the building downtown and here. She was in jeans now, an old gray sweater he recognized from years ago, her curled hair pulled back into a low knot, all the polish from the afternoon scrubbed away. She looked tired, in a way that went deeper than the hour. "Long day," she said, setting her handbag down on the counter, not quite meeting his eyes. "You said that this morning too," Daniel answered, keeping his voice light, easy, the voice of a man who suspected nothing. "Everything okay?" "Fine." She opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it for a moment without taking anything out, the cool light washing over her face, and he watched her shoulders rise and fall in a long breath before she shut the door again, empty-handed. "I think I'm just going to shower and go to bed early." "Vanessa." She turned, and for a second, something flickered across her face that he had not seen there in months, something that looked almost like relief, as if she were waiting for him to ask the right question, so she would finally have a reason to answer it. He felt the words rising in his throat. Where were you? Who was that man? What was in the folder? He swallowed them all. "Nothing," he said instead. "Just wanted to see you before you disappeared into the shower." Something in her face closed again, gently, like a curtain drawn at the end of a scene. "I'm sorry I've been distant," she said. "There's just some stuff I'm working through. I'll explain when I can." "When you can," he repeated. "Soon," she said, and for one moment she sounded almost like she meant it, before she turned and walked down the hall toward the bathroom, leaving her handbag sitting on the counter, exactly where she'd set it down. Daniel stood very still, looking at that bag for a long time after the bathroom door clicked shut and the pipes groaned to life behind it. He told himself he would not go through her things. He had told himself the same thing an hour ago, sitting at this very table, and had still ended up searching a stranger's name online with the same guilty energy of a man checking a lock twice. Her phone buzzed once on the counter beside the bag, the screen lighting up just long enough for him to catch the first few words of a message before it went dark again. He did not pick it up. He did not need to. He had already seen enough. A name at the top of the notification, short and plain, the same name from the directory board downtown. "Doyle," confirmed the second account. "Call me when you're ready to talk it through." The water shut off down the hall sooner than he expected, and Daniel stepped back from the counter fast, putting distance between himself and the phone before the bathroom door opened again. He moved to the sink and started rinsing out the 2 cold coffee cups, his hands working on their own while his mind turned the message over and over. A second account, confirmed. It was not the language of an affair. It was the language of money, of paperwork, of something that had existed quietly for a long time before today and was only now being dragged into the light. And the only second account Daniel could think of, the only thing in his own life that fit that description, was something he had built so carefully out of sight that even he sometimes managed to forget it was there. He thought of a small monthly transfer he made from a separate account Vanessa had never once asked about, an account he had opened years before they married, back when it still felt like his own business and no one else's. He thought of the careful way he always logged into that account from his phone instead of the shared laptop, the way he never let the balance show up on any screen she might glance at. He had told himself for years that it was not really a secret, simply something old that no longer mattered, Something that did not need explaining, because it did not touch the life he and Vanessa were building together. Standing at the sink with warm water running over his hands, he understood, with a cold and sudden clarity, that he had been wrong about that for a very long time. He dried his hands slowly, watching the hallway light spill out from under the bathroom door, and somewhere in his chest, a different kind of fear began to settle in. One that had nothing to do with another man in a gray jacket, and everything to do with a name he had not let himself think about properly in 8 years. When Vanessa finally came out in her robe, her hair damp and pushed back from her face, she found him standing in the same spot by the sink, the dish towel still in his hands. "You're still up," she said, surprised. "Couldn't sleep yet," he said, thinking about work stuff. She studied him for a moment, and he wondered, with a fresh jolt of unease, whether she could see straight through him, the same way he had spent all afternoon trying and failing to see through her. But she only nodded, said goodnight, and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving the hallway light on behind her the way she always did when she expected him to follow soon after. He did not follow right away. He stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the house settle around him, and when he was finally certain she had drifted off, he walked quietly down the hall, past their bedroom door, and into the small office at the end of the house, where they kept the filing cabinet, the old shoebox of receipts, every piece of paper that might tell him what his wife already knew, and he still did not. He had told himself, hours ago, that he would not go digging through her things tonight. Standing in the doorway of that office now, the moonlight falling pale across the carpet, he understood that decision had quietly come undone, somewhere between the kitchen sink and this hallway, and that there was no version of tonight left, where he simply went to bed and waited for an explanation that might never come on its own. The filing cabinet held nothing but the usual things, tax returns and warranty papers and old insurance documents, all exactly where they should be, none of it telling him anything he did not already know. He worked through it quietly, careful not to let the metal drawers rattle too loud in the sleeping house, his ears tuned the whole time toward the bedroom down the hall, in case the floor creaked under Vanessa's weight, and she woke to find him gone from bed. It was in the bottom drawer, tucked behind a folder of old car maintenance records, that he found her notebook. It was small, spiral-bound, the cover soft and worn at the corners from being carried around in a bag for a long time. He almost did not open it. Some last small piece of him still wanted to believe that closing this drawer right now and going to bed was a choice he could still make, that there was a version of tomorrow where none of this had happened. He opened it anyway. The first several pages were unremarkable, grocery lists, a sketch of a kitchen layout she had clearly been imagining for some future renovation, a few lines of a poem that did not seem finished. But near the middle of the notebook, the handwriting changed, grew smaller and tighter, the way handwriting does when a person is writing something they do not want anyone else to accidentally read over their shoulder. Second account opened 9 years ago, the entry read. Monthly transfers begin 8 years ago, same week each month, same amount, never missed. Daniel's hands had gone cold around the notebook. Doyle thinks it's a support payment, the next line read. Asked him to confirm a name on the account. Said he'd need a few more days. He turned the page, and there, in Vanessa's small, careful handwriting, underlined twice, was a name he had not heard out loud in 8 years, a name that still, even now, even after everything, made something in his chest seize up like a fist closing. Marlene Hutton. Beneath it, in handwriting that looked like it had been pressed harder into the page than anything else in the notebook, if this is what I think it is, I need to know everything before I say a word to him. Daniel sat down hard on the edge of the desk chair, the notebook still open in his lap, and for a long moment, he simply could not breathe properly. 8 years. She had found a thread 8 years deep into a part of his life he had never once mentioned to her, not on their first date, not on their wedding day, not in any of the quiet late-night conversations where two people are supposed to tell each other everything that matters. He thought of Marlene the way he always allowed himself to think of her, carefully, from a distance, the way you might look at a photograph of someone from a country you used to live in but never planned to visit again. They had been together for less than a year, a relationship that had ended badly and quickly, long before he ever imagined a future with anyone like Vanessa. When Marlene had called him, 8 years ago now, to tell him she was pregnant, he had been 26 years old and terrified in a way he had never been before or since. He had not been ready. That was the simplest, truest way he had ever managed to explain it to himself in the years since, late at night, alone with his own thoughts. He had not been ready to be a father, had not trusted himself to be a good one, not after growing up the way he had, with a father of his own who treated fatherhood like an inconvenient appointment he kept rescheduling, until eventually he stopped showing up at all. Daniel had been so afraid of becoming that same kind of absence that he had convinced himself the kindest thing he could do was step back entirely and simply send money, quietly, reliably, every single month, and let Marlene raise the boy without the burden of a father who did not believe he had it in him to do the job properly. He had told himself, for 8 years, that this was a private grief, a private failure, something that belonged only to him and did not need to be carried by anyone else, least of all a wife who deserved a husband without that kind of weight hanging over him. He understood now, sitting in the dark office with his wife's notebook open in his lap, exactly how badly he had misjudged that decision. Marlene Hutton, he read again. And beneath that, smaller, almost an afterthought, a single word that hit him harder than anything else in the entire notebook. Caleb. He had never let himself learn the boy's name. Marlene had told him once, in their last conversation 8 years ago, and he had made himself forget it on purpose, the way you might force yourself to forget the name of a song that makes you cry every time you hear it. Seeing it now in his own wife's handwriting, in a notebook she had hidden at the bottom of a drawer he had not opened in over a year, undid something in him that he had kept very carefully tied down for a very long time. He sat there until the sky outside the office window began to lighten at the edges, turning the page back and forth in his hands without really reading it anymore, simply staring at that one underlined name, until the letters stopped looking like a name at all and started looking like a verdict. By the time he heard Vanessa's alarm go off down the hall, he had made a decision, though it had cost him most of the night to arrive at it. He could not wait for Doyle to finish confirming whatever he was confirming. He could not sit across the breakfast table from his wife one more morning, watching her carry the weight of a secret that was not even hers to carry, while he pretended not to notice the tired hollows under her eyes, or the way her hand trembled slightly around her coffee cup these days. He returned the notebook exactly where he had found it, smoothing the folder of car maintenance records back over it, and closed the drawer as quietly as he had opened it. Then he sat at the kitchen table and waited for her to come find him, the way he had waited for her the night before, except this time he was not the one with a secret to keep hidden behind a calm face. When Vanessa walked into the kitchen, already dressed for work, her hair pulled back, her face carefully composed in the way he now recognized as a kind of armor, she stopped in the doorway when she saw him sitting there. "You're up early." "I need to tell you something," Daniel said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, cracked at the edges in a way that made her go very still in the doorway, her hand still resting against the frame. "Before you go to work, before anything else happens today." Something shifted behind her eyes, a kind of bracing he recognized from his own reflection over the last 24 hours. The look of a person standing at the edge of a conversation they have been dreading and circling for a very long time. "Okay," she said quietly, and pulled out the chair across from him, the same chair she had sat in for 6 years of breakfasts and arguments and quiet ordinary mornings, and waited. Daniel looked at his hands on the table, at the wedding ring he had worn every day for 6 years, without once telling the woman who gave it to him the one thing about his past that might have changed how she felt about putting it there in the first place. 8 years ago, he started, and then stopped, and made himself start again. "Before I knew you, there was someone. Her name was Marlene." He watched Vanessa's face very carefully as he said the name, looking for the flicker of recognition, the proof that she already knew exactly where this sentence was headed. He found it almost immediately, a small, tight nod, her jaw set in a way that told him she had been carrying this knowledge alone for longer than he had realized, maybe for weeks, maybe longer, bracing for a confession that had taken him this long to find the courage to give her. "I know about Marlene," she said, her voice very even, very controlled, the voice of someone holding something together by sheer effort of will. "I've known her name for 3 weeks now. What I don't know yet, Daniel, is the rest of it. I don't know why you never told me. And I don't know who Caleb is to you. Not really. Not in your own words." The sound of his son's name in his wife's mouth, said for the first time out loud between them after 8 years of silence, hit him harder than anything Doyle's folder or her hidden notebook had managed to do. He sat back in his chair, the weight of it finally fully landing, and understood that whatever came next in this kitchen would change the shape of his marriage for good, one way or another, and that he had no one to blame for arriving at this moment but himself. "I should have told you before we got married," Daniel said. "I know that. I've known it for 6 years, and I let myself believe it didn't matter anymore. Because it happened before you. Because I wasn't part of his life in any real way. Because the money just went out every month, and nothing ever had to change." "Nothing ever had to change," Vanessa repeated, and there was something dangerous in the flatness of her voice, a control she was clearly fighting to hold on to. "Daniel, I found a second account I didn't know existed. I found 8 years of monthly transfers to a woman I'd never heard of. For 3 weeks I thought you were either in debt to someone, or being blackmailed, or seeing her. I sat across from a stranger in a coffee shop trying to figure out which version of you I was actually married to, because the one sitting in front of me every night clearly wasn't telling me the whole truth." "It wasn't an affair," Daniel said quickly, the word landing too sharp in the quiet kitchen. "Vanessa, I would never." "I know that now," she cut in. "Doyle confirmed the payments matched a child support arrangement 2 days ago. I've known for 2 days that you have a son, and you still hadn't said a single word to me about it, even when I started wearing dresses I never wear, and leaving without telling you where I was going, hoping you'd finally ask me directly so I wouldn't have to be the one to bring it up first. The dress. The heels already on before she'd even left the house. He understood it now, the calm, deliberate performance of it. Not a woman slipping away to someone else, but a woman testing whether her own husband would finally notice something was wrong enough to ask a real question. "I've got somewhere to be," he said quietly, almost to himself, hearing the words land differently now than they had in the hallway the day before. "I was hoping you'd ask where," Vanessa said, and for the first time since she had walked into the kitchen, her composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for him to see the hurt underneath the careful control. "I wanted you to care enough to ask. Instead, you followed me." His stomach dropped. "You knew." "Owen mentioned a man lurking outside the cafe window," she said. It wasn't hard to guess who that might have been. Daniel pressed both hands flat against the table, steadying himself against the wave of shame rolling through him, layered now on top of everything else. The secret, the silence, the 8 wasted years, and now this too. The fact that even his attempt to find the truth had been clumsy and small, crouched behind a newspaper rack like a man with something to hide, rather than something to confess. "I panicked when I saw the dress," he said. "I thought you were seeing someone. I followed you because I couldn't stand not knowing, and then I came home and went through your things instead of just asking you to your face, which is exactly the same mistake I made 8 years ago, except this time, it was you I was hiding from instead of myself." Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed somewhere past his shoulder, out the window toward the street where the morning light was beginning to spread gold across the lawn. When she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped lower, rougher, all the careful control finally giving way to something closer to grief. "Does he know you exist?" she asked. "Caleb, does he know he has a father somewhere? Or did you make sure of that too, the same way you made sure I never knew?" Daniel opened his mouth to answer and found that no answer came. He had asked Marlene, once, years ago, in one of the only conversations they'd had since the early payments began, whether she had told their son anything about him at all. She had said simply, "Not yet," and he had let himself feel relieved by that answer instead of ashamed of it, had let 8 years pass without ever asking the question again, without ever finding out whether a small boy somewhere in the world wondered why he didn't have a father the way other kids did, or whether he had simply stopped wondering a long time ago because no one had ever given him a reason to keep hoping. The silence stretched out between them, longer and heavier than anything that had passed between Daniel and Vanessa in 6 years of marriage, and in that silence he understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly how much damage 8 years of careful, quiet avoidance could do, not only to the people who knew about it, but to the one small person who had never been given the choice to know anything at all. Vanessa stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the floor, the sound loud and final in the quiet kitchen. "I need to think," she said. "I need air, and I need you to not follow me this time." "Vanessa." "I'm not leaving you, Daniel," she said, her voice cracking now, the tears finally breaking through the control she had held onto for 3 full weeks. "But I can't sit in this kitchen right now and watch you not have an answer to that question. I need a few hours. Please." She walked out of the kitchen without waiting for him to respond, and a moment later he heard the front door open and close, gently, almost carefully, as if even now, in the middle of the worst morning of their marriage, some part of her could not bring herself to slam it. Daniel sat alone at the table, the morning light stretching slowly across the floor, and for the first time in 8 years he let himself say the boy's name out loud, just once, just to himself, into the empty kitchen. Caleb. It did not feel like relief. It felt like the first true thing he had said in longer than he wanted to admit, and it left him sitting there long after the sound of it had faded, staring at the door his wife had just walked through, with no idea at all what kind of marriage, or what kind of father, he was going to find on the other side of the next conversation he still had to have. Daniel did not go to work that day. He sat in the quiet house for a long time after Vanessa left, staring at his phone, scrolling through contacts he had not opened in years, until he found the number he had kept saved under a single letter, M, so that it would never accidentally surface in a search of his full contact list. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long time before he finally pressed it. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered, older than he remembered it, a little rougher around the edges, carrying the particular tiredness of someone who had spent 8 years raising a child mostly on her own. "Daniel," Marlene said, and there was no surprise in her voice at all, which told him almost everything he needed to know. "I wondered when you'd call. Owen mentioned someone had been asking questions about the payments." "I should have called a long time before this," Daniel said. "I'm sorry it took someone else finding out for me to finally do it." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that he wondered if she had hung up, until he heard her exhale, slow and measured, the sound of someone choosing her next words with care. "He's 8 years old," she said finally. "He likes dinosaurs and terrible jokes, and he's stubborn in exactly the way you used to be, which I used to find annoying about you and now find unbearably sweet in him, which I suppose is how these things work." Daniel felt his throat tighten so suddenly he had to press the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment before he could trust himself to speak again. "Does he know about me?" "He knows he has a father somewhere who isn't around," Marlene said carefully. "I never told him the details. I always thought that conversation belonged to you, whenever you were ready to have it, if you were ever ready to have it at all." "I want to be ready," Daniel said. "I don't know if that's the same thing as actually being ready, but I want it. I should have wanted it 8 years ago." "You were 26 and terrified," Marlene said, and there was no real anger in her voice when she said it, only a kind of tired honesty that hurt more than anger would have. "I was angry with you for a long time, Daniel, but I stopped being angry a while ago. I just hoped, somewhere along the way, that you'd find your way to being braver than your own father managed to be. It sounds like maybe you finally are." "How did you manage, all those years?" Daniel asked. "Doing this on your own?" Marlene was quiet for a moment before answering. "One ordinary day at a time," she said. "There was no trick to it. I just kept showing up, even on the days I didn't feel like a particularly good mother, even on the days I was exhausted and short-tempered, and not at all who I wanted to be for him. I think people imagine parenting is made of big moments, but mostly, it's just the small ones, stacked up, one after another, until they add up to something. You missed 8 years of small ones. I won't pretend that doesn't matter, but there are still a lot of small ones left, if you want them." "I do," Daniel said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it more fully than he had meant almost anything in years. "Then don't make promises you can't keep," Marlene said, her voice firmer now, the voice, he imagined, she used when setting boundaries for her son. "If you say every Saturday, it has to actually be every Saturday. He's already learned once that a parent's word doesn't always hold. I won't watch him learn it twice." "Every Saturday," Daniel repeated, the words landing in him like a vow, heavier and more binding than anything he had said at his own wedding, if only because this one came with a small boy's trust attached to it, a trust that had not yet been earned and could not be assumed. They talked for almost an hour, longer than Daniel would have guessed himself capable of staying on the phone with her, working through small practical questions that felt enormous, given how long they had gone unasked. Whether Caleb liked sports or books more, whether he was shy around new people or the opposite, whether there was a right way, a careful way, to introduce a stranger into a little boy's life as something as significant as a father, without it feeling to him like a stranger walking in and rearranging the furniture of his entire world. By the time he hung up, the afternoon light had shifted across the kitchen floor, and his hands were unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with fear of being caught anymore, and everything to do with the strange, raw hope settling underneath all the guilt, a hope he had not let himself feel in 8 years, because feeling it had always seemed like more than he deserved. Vanessa came home a little after 5, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her movements slower and more deliberate than he was used to, like a person picking her way carefully across uneven ground. She found him still at the kitchen table, the same chair he had not really left all day, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, studying him. "You look different," she said. "Did something happen?" "I called Marlene," Daniel said. "I talked to her about Caleb, about what comes next." Vanessa came and sat down across from him, slower than usual, the way someone sits when their whole body is tired from carrying something heavy for too many hours. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me everything, Daniel. Not the version you tell yourself in your head to make it bearable. The real version." So he did. He told her about Marlene, about the year they had spent together before he ever knew Vanessa existed, about the phone call 8 years ago that had sent him into a panic so complete he had not trusted himself to make a single good decision in the weeks that followed. He told her about his own father, a man who had drifted in and out of his childhood like weather, present just often enough to make the absences hurt more, and how the fear of becoming that exact kind of disappointment had felt, at 26, like the only honest reason he had for staying away. He told her how the monthly payments had started as a temporary arrangement, something he told himself he would revisit once he felt ready, and how that revisiting had simply never come, year after year, until the secret had grown so large and so old that telling her had started to feel impossible rather than simply difficult. Vanessa listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped tight around a mug of tea she had made for herself but not yet touched, and when he finally finished, the kitchen sat in a silence that felt different from the one earlier that morning, less brittle, though still far from settled. "I'm angry," she said finally. "I want you to know that. I'm angry that I had to find this out from a notebook and a private investigator instead of from my own husband. I'm angry that there's a little boy out there who spent his whole life without you, because you decided, on your own, without ever giving either of us the chance to weigh in, that staying away was somehow the kinder choice." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "I don't have a defense for any of that." "I'm not finished," she said, and her voice wavered slightly before steadying again. "I'm also not leaving. I thought about it today, sitting in the park for 3 hours like some kind of cliché, trying to decide what I actually wanted. And what I want, Daniel, is a husband who doesn't carry things alone for 8 years, out of fear of what I'll think of him. I can handle a complicated truth. What I can't handle is being kept on the outside of one." "Then let me bring you in," he said. "All the way in, whatever that looks like from here." Vanessa reached across the table and took his hand, the first time she had touched him since the morning before, when she had straightened his collar in the hallway with a secret already balanced on her tongue. Her grip was tight, almost fierce, the grip of someone choosing to hold on rather than let go, even with everything still unresolved between them. "I want to meet him," she said. "Caleb, not right away, not until you've had your own first conversation with him, the one that's just yours to have, but after that, I want to be there. I want to be part of whatever this becomes, if he and his mother are willing to let us in." Daniel nodded, unable to speak for a moment around the tightness in his throat, and outside the kitchen window the evening had settled fully now, the porch light clicking on with its small automatic hum, the ordinary mechanics of a house that had no idea how much had shifted inside it that day. 2 days later, Marlene called to say Caleb wanted to know why a stranger named Daniel was suddenly going to start visiting, and would Daniel like to come by on Saturday and explain it to him himself, in whatever way felt true. Daniel said yes before she had even finished the sentence, and then sat with the phone still in his hand for a long time afterward, staring at the calendar on the kitchen wall where Saturday sat circled now in his own handwriting, 4 days away, the most frightening appointment he had ever willingly made for himself. That night, lying in bed beside Vanessa for the first time since everything had come apart and slowly begun, carefully, to come back together, Daniel found himself thinking not about the conversation with Marlene, or the 8 lost years, or even the dress in the hallway and the line that had started all of this. He thought instead about a small boy somewhere across town who liked dinosaurs and terrible jokes, and did not yet know that the stranger coming to his door on Saturday had spent 8 years too afraid to find out exactly how much he had been missing. He called Ray the next morning, finally, after putting it off for a full day out of some lingering instinct to keep handling everything alone the way he always had. Ray listened without interrupting, the way he always did when something actually mattered, and when Daniel finished explaining it all, the silence on the line stretched out long enough that Daniel checked his phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. 8 years, Ray finally said, and his voice carried none of the judgment Daniel had braced himself for, only a kind of quiet disbelief. You've been carrying that alone for 8 years, and you never once thought to tell me, your own brother? I didn't think anyone could understand it without thinking less of me, Daniel admitted. I think less of you for hiding it, Ray said bluntly. I don't think less of you for being scared at 26. Those are two different things, and you've spent 8 years treating them like the same one. It was, Daniel thought afterward, exactly the kind of thing Ray had always been better at than him, cutting straight to the center of a problem without flinching away from the parts that stung. They talked for a while longer about Saturday, about what a person was even supposed to say to an 8-year-old who had spent his whole life without a father, and was about to meet one for the first time, and Ray, who had no children of his own, and no particular expertise in the matter, still managed to offer the one piece of advice that stuck with Daniel for the rest of the week. Don't try to explain the 8 years, Ray said, not on day one. He's 8, Daniel, not a judge. He doesn't need a defense. He needs you to show up, and then show up again the next time, and the time after that, until showing up stops being a surprising thing you did once, and starts being just who you are to him. Vanessa, for her part, spent the days before Saturday in a quiet, steady kind of motion that Daniel found himself grateful for in ways he did not entirely know how to express. She did not push him to talk more than he was ready to. She did not bring up the 8 years again, not because she had stopped being hurt by them, he understood, but because she seemed to recognize that there would be time later for that conversation, and that right now the more urgent thing was simply getting him through the door on Saturday in one piece. On Friday evening, she found him standing in the toy aisle of a store neither of them had set foot in for years, staring at a wall of options with an expression of complete and total helplessness. I have no idea what an 8-year-old wants, he admitted when she found him there, having texted to ask where he'd disappeared to after work. I keep picking things up and putting them back down because they all feel wrong. Too babyish, or too expensive, or like I'm trying too hard to buy my way into liking me. Vanessa studied the shelf for a moment, then reached past him and picked up a small plastic dinosaur, articulated at the joints, the kind of thing that could be twisted into a dozen different fighting poses. Marlene said he likes dinosaurs, she said. Don't overthink it. You're not trying to win him over with one toy. You're trying to show up and be a person worth getting to know. The toy is just an excuse to have something to do with your hands while you figure out how to talk to him. He looked at her for a long moment, struck again, the way he had been struck several times over the last difficult week, by how much steadier she was being about all of this than he had any right to expect. You didn't have to come help me pick out a dinosaur, he said, after everything. I didn't have to, she agreed. I wanted to. There's a difference, and I'd like you to remember it. The next time you're tempted to handle something enormous all by yourself, instead of letting me in. He bought the dinosaur, and on the drive home neither of them said much, the small plastic toy sitting in its bag on the dashboard between them, like a strange, fragile peace offering, to a future neither of them could fully picture yet. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, the kind of sky that seemed to match the nervous, unsettled feeling sitting in Daniel's stomach from the moment he woke up. He showered and dressed 3 separate times, changing his shirt twice for reasons he couldn't have explained to anyone, including himself, before Vanessa finally came into the bedroom, took one look at him standing in front of the mirror in his 3rd outfit of the morning, and gently took his hand. He's 8, she reminded him softly. He's not going to remember what shirt you wore. He's going to remember whether you were kind and whether you came back. What if I say the wrong thing? You probably will at some point, she said, with the first real smile he had seen from her in days. That's allowed. Nobody gets this exactly right the first time. You just have to keep trying after you get it wrong, which, from what I understand, is the entire point you've been missing for 8 years. He laughed, despite himself, a short, surprised sound that loosened something tight in his chest, and Vanessa squeezed his hand once before letting go. I'll drive you, she said. I'll wait in the car this first time. like we talked about. But I'm not letting you walk into this alone, not even as far as the front seat. The drive across town took 18 minutes, though it felt to Daniel like both far longer and far shorter than that, the streets sliding past in a blur he would not later be able to describe in any detail, his mind circling the same handful of sentences over and over, trying to find the right order for words he had been avoiding for 8 entire years. When Vanessa finally pulled up outside a small house with a blue door and a child's bicycle lying on its side in the front yard, Daniel sat very still in the passenger seat for a moment, the small plastic dinosaur in its bag resting on his knee, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. "You don't have to be perfect today," Vanessa said quietly, watching him. "You just have to be there." Daniel nodded, unable to find any words at all, and reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly as he pushed the car door open and stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of the small blue house, the bicycle lying forgotten in the grass, the front door already opening as Marlene appeared in the doorway, and behind her, just visible in the shadow of the hallway, a small boy peering curiously around her hip at the stranger walking slowly up the front path toward him. The boy did not come forward right away. He stayed half hidden behind Marlene's hip, one hand gripping the fabric of her shirt, studying Daniel with the open, unguarded suspicion that only children seem able to manage, the kind of look that holds no manners at all, only honest curiosity. "Hi," Daniel said, and his voice came out smaller than he intended, almost as nervous as the boy looked. "I'm Daniel. Mom said you're my dad," Caleb said, not as a question, simply stating a fact he had been handed and was still turning over to see how it fit. "But I don't really know you." "That's true," Daniel said, crouching down slowly to bring himself closer to the boy's height, the way he had read somewhere, years ago, in some article he'd never expected to need, that you were supposed to do with children, to make yourself smaller and less looming. "I'd like to fix that, if you're willing to let me. I know it's strange, having someone show up out of nowhere and tell you they're your father." Caleb considered this with the same serious expression Daniel realized. With a small jolt, he recognized from his own face in old photographs the exact same furrowed brow his mother used to tease him about as a boy. "Why weren't you here before?" Caleb asked, the question landing with the simple, devastating directness only a child could manage. Daniel had spent 4 days rehearsing different answers to this exact question, and every single one of them deserted him now. Standing on the front path with the small plastic dinosaur forgotten in his hand, he thought of Ray's advice, not to explain the 8 years, not on day one. And he understood now, kneeling on this sidewalk, exactly what his brother had meant. "I was scared," Daniel said instead, the simplest version of the truth he could find. "I was scared I wouldn't be a good dad, and instead of trying and maybe getting it wrong, I just stayed away, which was a bigger mistake than anything I was afraid of in the first place. I'm sorry it took me this long to figure that out." Caleb studied him a moment longer, then glanced down at the bag in Daniel's hand. "What's that?" Oh, Daniel had almost forgotten he was holding it. He opened the bag and held out the small, articulated dinosaur, suddenly feeling foolish, certain it was exactly the wrong gift, too simple, too small a gesture for everything it was meant to stand in for. "Your mom said you liked dinosaurs." I didn't really know what else to bring. Caleb's whole face changed at the sight of it, the wariness cracking open into something brighter and more familiar, a child's pure, uncomplicated delight. He stepped forward, finally letting go of his mother's shirt, and took the toy carefully in both hands, turning it over to examine the joints. "This one can do the death roll," he announced, twisting the dinosaur's tail in a sudden violent arc that made Daniel laugh despite the tightness still sitting in his chest. "Do you know what a death roll is?" "I don't," Daniel admitted. "Will you show me?" And just like that, with no further ceremony, no grand reconciliation, no speech that tied up 8 years of absence into something neat and forgivable, Caleb sat down right there on the front step and began explaining, in exhaustive and entirely serious detail, the hunting behavior of crocodiles and how it related to the dinosaur in his hand, while Daniel sat beside him, nodding along, asking questions he did not entirely understand the answers to, feeling something in his chest loosen that had been clenched tight for 8 long years. From the car parked at the curb, Vanessa watched the two of them through the windshield, her hand pressed lightly against her own mouth. And though Daniel could not see her face clearly from this distance, he would learn later, that evening, that she had cried quietly in the driver's seat the entire time. Not from sadness, she told him, but from something closer to relief, watching a small boy hand his father a second chance, with no more ceremony than a question about death rolls. That first visit lasted just over an hour, Marlene gently suggesting it was probably enough for one day, and Daniel agreeing immediately, not wanting to overwhelm a boy who had only just met him, even as some part of him wanted to stay on that front step all afternoon, soaking up every detail he had missed for 8 years in a single sitting. Before he left, Caleb looked up at him with the dinosaur still clutched in one hand and asked, with the same blunt honesty as before, whether Daniel would come back. "Every week, if your mom says it's okay," Daniel told him. "And I won't be late, and I won't disappear again. You can hold me to that." "I will," Caleb said seriously, and something about the certainty in his small voice, the simple, trusting way he accepted the promise without demanding proof first, stayed with Daniel the entire drive home, sitting quiet in the passenger seat while Vanessa drove, her hand reaching over once to rest on his knee, without either of them needing to say anything at all. The weeks that followed were not simple, and Daniel never expected them to be. There were Saturday visits that went easily, full of dinosaurs and terrible jokes exactly as Marlene had promised, and there were others that went harder, moments when Caleb's questions cut closer to the 8 missing years than Daniel felt ready for, when the boy's hurt surfaced sideways, in a sudden flash of temper over something small and unrelated, the way grief in children often does. Daniel learned, slowly, the way Ray had told him he would, that showing up was not a single act but a habit, something built one ordinary Saturday at a time, with no shortcuts, and no single conversation that could repair 8 years all at once. Vanessa met Caleb properly 6 weeks after that first visit, on a Saturday afternoon at the park near their house, an introduction the 3 adults had planned carefully, wanting to give the boy time to feel steady in his relationship with Daniel, before adding anyone else into the picture. Daniel had worried, in the days leading up to it, about how Caleb might react to a stepmother arriving on top of everything else that had already changed in his small world. But Vanessa, true to the steadiness she had shown from that first terrible morning in the kitchen, simply sat down beside him on a park bench, asked him about dinosaurs, and let the conversation build from there, at whatever pace the boy needed. "She's funny," Caleb told Daniel afterward, with the same blunt seriousness he brought to everything, "funnier than you." "That's true," Daniel agreed, and meant it. There were harder days too, days Daniel did not let himself forget, simply because the story had begun to bend toward something gentler. One Saturday in late autumn, Caleb refused to come out of his room when Daniel arrived, and Marlene, standing in the hallway with an apologetic look on her face, explained quietly that a classmate had asked Caleb that week why his dad had 2 different families, and the question had unsettled something in him that neither of them had fully prepared for. Daniel sat down on the floor outside Caleb's closed bedroom door, not trying to open it, simply sitting there within earshot, and talked quietly through the wood about nothing important at all, a baseball game from the night before, a dinosaur documentary he'd watched and gotten several facts wrong about on purpose, hoping Caleb might correct him through the door if nothing else. It took almost 20 minutes before the door finally opened, just a crack, Caleb's face appearing in the gap, eyes red but curious despite himself. "You got the wingspan wrong," Caleb said. "Pterodactyls aren't even real dinosaurs. People always get that wrong." "Then you'd better come tell me the right answer," Daniel said, "because I clearly need the help." It was not a grand resolution, not the kind of moment that wrapped up an 8-year absence in a single tidy conversation, but Caleb came out of his room, and they spent the next hour on the living room floor with a stack of library books about prehistoric creatures spread between them, and by the time Daniel left that evening, the question about 2 families had not been fully answered, only set down gently for another day, which Ray told him later was probably the most honest kind of progress there was. Vanessa, for her part, grew steadier in her own role with each visit, careful never to crowd the space that belonged specifically to Daniel and Caleb, but always present at the edges of it, in small, consistent ways, sending Caleb a postcard from a work trip with a fact about ancient sea creatures she had looked up specifically for him, remembering without being asked that he liked his sandwiches cut into triangles and not squares, showing up to a school holiday concert in December, even though Caleb's class only sang 2 songs, and the whole thing lasted less than 20 minutes. Daniel watched her build that relationship one small, patient gesture at a time, and found himself thinking, more than once, that whatever had broken between them in that terrible week back in the spring had not simply been repaired, but had grown into something with deeper roots than what came before it, the kind of trust that exists only on the far side of having survived something difficult together. Marlene, too, settled into an easier rhythm with both of them than Daniel had dared to hope for in those first uncertain weeks. She remained careful, watchful in the particular way of a mother who had raised a child alone for 8 years and was not about to hand over her vigilance easily, but she softened gradually, inviting Vanessa in for coffee after drop-offs, trading notes on Caleb's increasingly elaborate dinosaur opinions, building something that was not quite friendship, but was no longer the guarded distance of their first phone call either. By the time spring rolled back around, a full year after the afternoon Vanessa had stood in the hallway in a black dress and told her husband she had somewhere to be, Saturday visits had become so woven into the rhythm of their lives that it was hard for Daniel to remember what his weekends had looked like before them. Caleb had taken to calling him on the phone sometimes, unprompted, just to report some new fact he'd learned, or to ask, with the same blunt seriousness as always, why grown-ups did certain confusing things, questions Daniel did his best to answer honestly, even when he didn't entirely know the answer himself. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning much like the dozens that had come before it, Vanessa stood in the bedroom doorway watching Daniel knot his tie, the two of them getting ready for a school event Caleb had specifically asked them both to come to, a small science fair where he planned to present a poster about, predictably, dinosaurs. "You look nervous," Vanessa observed, leaning against the doorframe. "I am," Daniel admitted. "Parent stuff still makes me nervous. I don't know if that ever goes away." "I don't think it's supposed to," Vanessa said. "I think that's just what caring about someone feels like." She crossed the room and straightened his collar, the same gesture she had used in the hallway all those months ago, the gesture that had once carried a secret weight neither of them fully understood at the time. There was no secret in it now, only the plain, ordinary affection of two people who had walked through something difficult together and come out the other side still holding hands. "I've got somewhere to be," she said softly, echoing the words that had once nearly broken them apart, and this time she smiled when she said it, reaching for his hand instead of her keys, and together they walked out the front door to go and watch their son explain, in great and serious detail, exactly how a crocodile performs a death roll, and why, against every fear that had once kept Daniel silent for 8 long years, it turned out he was not so bad at being a father after all.